Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation entitled International Arts Policy France. Today, we'll be discussing the history of France, the Ministry of Cultures, cultural policies, the image of art, and France's relationship to the United States. France's famous Sun King, Louis XVI, ascended the throne during the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, at the same time spending huge amounts of money to build up France's art scene. Louis generously supported the royal court of France and those who worked under him. In 1539, France adopted French as the national language. Louis brought the Académie Française, the French council pertaining to the language, under his guidance and became its proctor. This academy set an official standard for language purity. The French educational system is highly centralized and free. Their educational system focuses on partaking in a society as opposed to being responsibly independent. Louis also patronized the visual and performing arts, latter founding the Académie Royale des Danses, Académie des Opéras, and seeing the fruition of the Palace of Versailles. The French Revolution began in 1789 with the ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte. During this period, French citizens raised and redesigned their administrative structures. The revolution was not confined to government, policy, or politics, and was a social and cultural phenomenon. As the revolution progressed, displays of loyalty became important. In particular, the willingness of an individual to immerse themselves in a revolutionary culture. Paris became the cultural hub of the world for its decorative Art Nouveau style. Family values and responsibility to your namesake comes before all others in providing financial and emotional support. The French have a practical view of marriage and its survival as an institution to the modern world. Politeness and a degree of formality are customary in France. Etiquette plays a strong part in French lives. It's best to wait until you're invited to do so before you call a Frenchman by his name, and handshakes are most common form of greeting. When shopping, bonjour or bonsoir, monsieur or madame is polite, as is au revoir before leaving a shop. France takes great pride in their language and appreciates you not expecting them to speak English. When invited to a French home for a meal, guests should always arrive on time and bring a gift, such as chocolates, flowers, or a good wine, and dress to the nines as style is everything. The dress code tends to be formal and elegant. As a whole, the French are very proud of their national identity. The Ministry of Culture conducts the policy of safeguard, protection, and enhancement of cultural heritage while promoting the creation of works of art and the development of artistic practices and teachings. The mission of this ministry is to make accessible to as many people as possible the major works of humanity, and first of all, of France. In this capacity, the ministry develops cultural policy directed at the protection and enhancement of cultural heritage in all its aspects, and supports the creation of works and the development of practices. It has four main goals. The first is to contribute, together with other ministries, to arts and cultural education of children and young adults through their training cycles. Second, it encourages local cultural initiatives, developing links between cultural policies of the state and local governments, bearing in mind the principles of subsidiarity and decentralization. Number 3, while overseeing the activity of cultural industries, it contributes to the development of new broadcasting technologies and the creation on cultural heritage. And number 4, it is concerned with cultural diplomacy, and it contributes to the cultural activity outside of France and actions of the French cultural institutions abroad. So while we now know what the policy is, who are the people who created it and are seeing it into fruition? André Malraux was the first Minister of Culture in France. He wrote the declaration that outlined the role of the first ministry. André wanted to set up an art center in each French county in order to encourage contemporary artistic creation and disseminate culture on a broad scale. 9 maisons de culture, or ministries of culture, were eventually set up whose primary aim was to promote contemporary creation in all artistic disciplines. Jacques Dumal became the next Minister of Culture, instituting a policy that aimed at combining culture into society and responding to the issues of cultural development. He set up procedures to establish partnership contracts between the government and cultural institutions. In 1974, Michel Guy created a breakthrough for young artists in contemporary art by signing the first in a series of cultural development agreements with municipalities and regions. On top of the ministers of cultures and their role, every French president seemed to have a big cultural project. Georges Pompidou, France's president in the early 70s, built the Pompidou Center, dedicated to contemporary art with the spirit of André, but combined with his interest in the art form. Moving along, François Mitterrand encouraged a series of major construction policies known as, quote, the cultural, in his 14 years of power. A new period for cultural policies carried out by the minister Jack Lang included a doubling budget, gradually increasing to represent 1% of the state budget. During his ministry, the debate on cultural exception starts and leads to the international recognition of the necessity to promote and preserve cultural diversity. Minister Philippe Louis Blazet commissioned a report on the refoundation of a cultural policy. In May 2002, Jean-Jacques Aigan was appointed Minister of Culture. A law he implemented was renewing the conditions of cultural patronage, associations, and foundations. Renoir Dondieu de Vabres became minister, and his term was mainly spent tackling the crisis during the Avignon Theatre Festival. In 2007, after the election of President Nicolas Sarkozy, Christine Albanel was appointed and led the modernization of cultural policies while conserving the budget. Frédéric Mitterrand became Minister of Culture in 2009, institutionalizing culture for each. In 2012, Aurélie Filippetti was appointed following President François Hollande. In a difficult budgetary context, she decided to give up on some large-scale, expensive projects that had been programmed during the previous legislature. In 2014, Flore Pellerin became the new Minister of Culture, involving herself in the preparation of law on freedom of creation, architecture, and heritage. She also set up an emergency fund to support the performing arts enterprise following the terrorist attacks. In 2016, Audrey Azoulay is elected with her attempt to increase public support to culture. France is predominantly a publicly funded country in terms of art. Policies that encourage French works come from the state. The main part of support is not that it's direct support, but rather it's a law. These policies can be umbrellaed into 5 different categories: books, visual art, music, performing arts, and cinema and audiovisual. The next slides will take a closer look into each of the umbrellaed categories. Policies supporting the book industry are subject to complex mechanisms since they must take into account all the players concerned. This includes writers, publishers, booksellers, libraries, conservation of the written heritage, etc. These actions are focused according to several orientations. In particular, support for the book industry, promotion of public reading, and finally management of tax and legislative measures intended to support the whole book chain. Probably less affected than other cultural industries by the digital revolution, the book industry must nonetheless take into account these trends for its own future and, in particular, the problems related to the respect of the author's rights. These are some of the highlighted policies that support the book industry. Due to the protection of listed or antique art, support to the contemporary visual arts has been long neglected. However, for roughly 30 years, we have been providing massive support as an art form that cannot be ignored. These policies aim to reinforce the cultural practices of French people through promotional and educational efforts. These are some of the policies that help support the visual arts. Cultural policy towards music first took its form of financial support for the quote, classical music institutions, where the stakes were the preservation, transmission, and democratization of the music heritage and its practices, conservatories, music schools, educational and diffusion institutions. These are some of the policies that support music. The public authorities, being the state and territorial communities, have always, and more so during the past 60 years, supported the performing arts. This support involves funding as well as dedicating to support schemes for the private performing arts. It is meant to encourage not only the diversity of the performing arts, but also the dynamism of a sector of great cultural and economic vitality. These are just a few of the policies. The financial stakes around this industry are quite large. The preservation of cinema are a huge importance in France, where roughly 300 French films are released every year, with an attendance of roughly 180 million viewers, which would require both tax and budgetary provisions. Pre-war, the state showed very little interest in the industry until the foundation of the National Center of Cinematography, or the CNC. This marked a decisive turning point in the ambitious, large-scale cultural policy by creating the genuine originality of the current system. Here are a couple of the policies. The French view art as a national priority, and therefore the choices have been made by the state, which is a very different way of thinking for us here in America. While the Ministry of Culture is rather new, the role of the state in culture is not. It has always been at the core of the French policy. Even though the state is bureaucratic, the idea is that the state reflects the citizen. There is a difference in the legitimacy of public choices, and it's rooted in France's DNA, particularly visible in the arts. In France, their approach is called cultural exception. The exception is culture. If you give all the power to consumers to choose what they deem worthy or important, there is a high risk of missing out on notable experiences. The French deeply believe that all the power must not go to the people or individual donors. There is a particular love and pride for film in France, as it is the birthplace for cinema. The very first screening happened in Paris on December 28, 1895. While over 100 years later, France has the largest numbers of cinemas throughout Europe, with over 2,000 movie theaters in the country. Not only is cinema well respected, but it is also well rewarded, due to its part in its protection by the French government. There is a state agency, entitled the CNC, whose sole purpose is to promote and protect French movies. While the CNC has a sizable budget, it does not all come from the government. It comes from a variety of taxes, including a portions of tickets sold. While this idea may seem unfair to a degree, it gives the opportunity to Hollywood blockbuster movies, granting a portion of their ticket sales to help smaller budget films in France that may not have had the opportunity otherwise. The better a cinema does, the more a producer or distributor takes risk with new scenarios, filmmakers, and young actors. Thanks to lucrative tax breaks, France has opened the idea to more foreign film productions. French landmarks that have been showcased in these films have had influxes of people flocking to the scenes to visit the sites. And it's in fact a snowball effect. Once you boost tourism, you boost job creation and the economy as a whole. What's crazy for us Americans to think is that in France, essentially, an artist can live off of their profession, and they don't have to wait tables or pick up a second job. Artists say they deserve this type of cultural exception. But of course, while in this booming industry, it is not without controversy. Critics say there are way too many French films to keep this idea afloat. One could make a claim that the French actor is paid too much, and that they actually take advantage of this publicly funded system. A major scandal took place in 2013 when a government commission report revealed that the vast majority of French films were not profitable. However, the French people are a strong collective, and a lot of people came out in defense of the French, saying that the reason French cinema is so good and that they are not crushed by Hollywood is because of their system. There was, however, a controversy at the Cannes Film Festival. In accordance to the French law, films are presented in cinemas first and then available for streaming years later. While unions are prepared to compromise, the cultural differences must be respected. Netflix, they say, is a stowaway and not acceptable for French cinema operators. Even if Netflix provides high quality productions, a laptop could never compete with the big screen. The French have this running theme. They don't want to lose the classics, they want to protect their own cultural achievements, and they never want to lose sight that cultural goods and services are essentially experience goods and services. France continues to strive upon their international approach to promoting culture and art. While France has played a very important role for the US, now the balance has shifted in the other directions, and America's universal presence is bold not only in France but worldwide. As you can see, American films displayed in France account for almost half of the box office receipts. American music is played about 40% of the time on French radio. About one-third of American novels are translated from French to English, as is about 30% of their TV. The paradox, though, is that throughout the U.S., our society is rather resistant to the idea of cultural expression from other countries, and France prides itself on being international. There is a complete lack of French art displayed on our TV stations, books, radio stations, and movies. I wonder if something like this can be addressed through public policy. If so, maybe it's an American problem and not a French problem. I wanted to put both France's Ministry of Culture and the United States National Endowment for the Arts side by side. There is no comparison to France in terms of public expenditure of the arts in relation to the US. We have major cultural envy. The budget for the NEA is roughly $150 million, and in France, that translation to euros puts the budget around $9 billion. By law, the money is not even directly appropriated, and the U.S. cannot give money directly to artists. They must give them to institutions who can assign them to artists, highlighting a difference between public and private funding. The U.S. culture for the arts is still a fraction on a per capita basis of what it is in France. If you take all of the support in the U.S., public and private art at all levels, it is roughly $55 per capita. $55 versus 116 euros or 125 US dollars per capita in France. But the biggest difference we can see is this idea of a national priority versus a marketplace economy. The government subsidizes all sorts of cultural outputs. Back in 1999, the former French president said, "Cultural exception is the idea that there is a richness in recognizing and respecting differences. It is the refusal of a global culture that is uniform, standardized, pre-formatted, and generic. The French policy is that culture should not be created like any other commodity that is at the mercy of supply and demand. The government must continue to protect and promote French culture subsidies." Along with state subsidies, France organizes a wide range of festivals where the government fixes book prices and sets a quota for the percentage of French songs that must be played on the radio. It's a very wide policy that actually costs the state a lot of money, a little over $9 billion per year. Critics say it should not be up to the state. To be a patron of the art while using public money is not fair. But the state argues that investing in culture is good for the economy. A combination of cultural activity brings in roughly 58 billion euros to the French economy each year. To put that in perspective, this is more than 7 times what the automobile industry contributes. Culture also produces tourism and many jobs in the industry. This also means that important bodies of works are produced in French, even if English is more of a universal language. This may be the reason the uproar and cultural exception needs to be protected. The French need to boost it. And remember that French culture needs to stay exceptional. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed my presentation on France. Before I go, I just wanted to input a little bit of my thoughts. While doing my research, I have found there is kind of this clear jealousy that American artists and art people have often felt the role art plays in France. And we as Americans have this deep belief that the French really love art and that its importance need not be defended by its society. And we believe that this esteemed position has been reflected in the amount of resources provided by the state to these French artists and cultural institutions. But unfortunately, here in the US, we don't see that kind of support. Our country is by nature very utilitarian and hasn't always understood the need for art in society. But in France, you can see that it enlivens the spirit and it provokes these civic debates and boosts democracy and really drives the economy. And although the U.S. has a diverse idea in its culture, many of the American artists and writers and musicians have all left the U.S. and gone to a European country such as France because it's provided this just great assistance and appreciation to their art form and has allowed them to be in residency and produce new works and premiere new pieces. And while the issue between the US and France usually involves money, the biggest difference I see is this idea of a public funding versus a private funding. The public being the state providing for France, and the private funding being this United States idea of more of a private philanthropy. And while both have their benefits, both certainly have their limitations. But the French, the idea with them is that they need to remain true to their historical identity by protecting the past cultural achievements. And unfortunately, it's something that money can't provide for anymore. With the recent effect of France on the terrorism and the flooding and the strikes that have happened, the government is actually hoping to send forth money and support its cultural institutions financially to maybe bring back those visitors to the country, which is something that's kind of been lacking in the past couple years. And there's been also research looking into the France maybe initiating more of a private philanthropy like we do here in the United States, but of course we know it has its limitations. Being in the art world is not financially the best thing, but of course emerging would be best, but where there's more of an individual and artistic support for the enterprise in France. But in summation, whatever the French decide to do, art will continue to maintain this statue of a core necessity. And every society going back has art from cave paintings to early stages of music to theater to performances. It's as much a universal truth as any other aspect of their humanity, and will hopefully continue to thrive and get better even in the lacking of the economy. But that's all I have for now. I really do hope that you enjoyed my presentation and you learned a little bit about a country that might have been foreign to you. Until next time, thank you so much again.